Hey everyone, welcome to our first week of class. This week we're going to do review of fundamentals. This is stuff that you should have covered in the previous semester. We're going to take 2 weeks to do review, and today we're going to start with these topics. We're going to look at variables, types, data structures, especially arrays, input and output, so that's printing and then also taking input from the user, and finally using modules. I'm going to focus for the next few weeks on doing this with simple games. So we're going to play some dice games, some card games, we'll maybe implement some board games. So it gives you kind of a grounded way to try out some of the stuff that we're remembering. Okay, so I have flipped over here to my text editor. The way that we're going to do a lot of stuff in class is that I'm going to write code, I'm going to talk you through it. You're going to actually watch me write the code. That means you're going to watch me make mistakes and debug them. I think this is a really useful process because even though I've written a lot of this code before, I still make the same kind of typos and little errors that you're likely to make, and so I want you to see the process of debugging. I probably will write some programs that just straight up don't work, and I expect them to work, and so I'll take you through my debugging process. It'll go a little fast if you're just trying to watch the video and code along. So what I recommend is that you have the video going, you try to write the code that I'm writing, and that you frequently pause the video, make sure you get your code up and running. Don't proceed until your code works. If you get stuck anywhere, send me an email or post to the discussion boards. I'm really good at debugging code quickly, and so I don't want you to spend hours trying to figure out stuff. I also will be posting all the code that I write in Canvas, so if there's something and you just can't see what the difference is or it isn't coming through clearly on the video, you can always look at the code that I've uploaded there. So what we're going to start with today is a basic dice rolling program. So there's a little bit more on this in the lecture notes, but dice, you've all encountered these, typically have 6 sides. You roll them, a number between 1 and 6 comes up. So we're going to start by writing a script that's just going to roll a die for us. So we're going to create a variable that I'll call die, and we want that to be set equal to some number between 1 and 6. For now, I'm just going to set it equal to 1, and this is a process that you'll see me do a lot. I like to write code in little tiny bits and make sure every bit works before I go on to the next one. This is by far the best way to write code. I have been coding since I was 6 years old. This has always worked for me. I've been teaching coding for a really long time, since I was an undergraduate, and people not doing this, people trying to jump in and write the whole thing, is the most common source of errors that I see, where there's just a bunch of stuff that's wrong. It's super hard to debug because someone tried to do everything at once. So here we're going to want our die to have a random number between 1 and 6 chosen. We don't know how to do that yet, so for now I'm just going to set it equal to 1. And then we want it to print out what that number is. So basically I can run this script and it's going to show me what the number is. And so to do that, I'm going to print die, and let's see if that works. So I'm going to save this as die.py in my scripts folder, and then I'll come over here to my shell, type Python, die.py, and it works. It gives me a 1. You can see that over here. If I run it again, another 1, a lot of 1s, and of course that's exactly what should be happening because I don't have it actually rolling a die, it's just printing a 1. All right, so we know now that we can have this number and get it printed correctly. The next thing that we want to do is get that die, instead of just being a 1 every time, to print out a random number. And so for that, we need something that you may not have used before. We're going to use a package called random. So if you remember, packages allow you to import existing functionality that's part of the Python language. We're going to do import random at the beginning. So random is one of those packages. Random has a bunch of different ways of randomly generating numbers. And there's a few different parts of that that we're going to use. There's one really easy one for what we're doing. We want to generate a number between 1 and 6. So we're going to use a function that's part of random called randint. So rand for random and int, int, for integer. To call that, we do random.randint. And then in parentheses, we put the lower bound and the upper bound. So we want a number between 1 and 6. We do 1, 6. You could do 3, 12, and that would give you a random number between 3 and 12. So that's it. We've just changed our 1 to say go to the random package, use this function randint to generate a random integer between 1 and 6. And now if we save that and flip back over to our scripts folder, we run that, We get a 6, now we get a 5, and we can see that we're randomly getting numbers generating. So that's working great. Now we have a dice rolling function. We have not put this in a proper function like in Python. It's just maintained in a script right now, and that's fine. We're going to talk about functions in the third week of the class because that was a more advanced thing that you did in the previous semester, so I'm going to review that much more in depth. But for now, we have the basics of what we need to roll a die. Okay, so we're going to come back here to the code. A lot of times you roll 2 dice. Lots of games have 2 dice instead of just 1. And so let's also do this code to roll 2 dice. So right now we have a variable die. That's going to roll 1. I'm just going to copy and paste that and then rename our variables to be die1 and die2. And so now it'll roll this random die twice. It's going to store the first value in the variable die1, the second value in the variable die2, and now I want to print them both out. So how do I do that? In the print, I print die right here, and I could do print die2, change this to die1, and that's going to print my numbers right next to each other. It's not going to look very good. So if we save it and flip over just to test, we're getting our numbers right here. So that's fine, but maybe I want to put them on the same line, say with a comma between them. To do that, I can put them all in one print statement, so I'm going to get rid of that second one, and concatenate them together. So remember that we do that with the plus sign, so maybe I put a comma and then die2. So I want it to be die1, comma, die2, so maybe 3, comma, 6. If we save that and try to run it, now we get an error. Why are we getting that error? We were able to print die1 by itself just fine. We certainly could just print a string like this. That works just fine. And this is essentially a little string here. We know we can print die2, so why do we get an error? And the reason for that comes back to types, which we want to review. So while we don't have to explicitly say that die1 is a string or die1 is an integer, Python is going to figure out what type of value it should store. And in this case, because we're using rand_int, we know that die1 is storing an integer. So die1 and die2 are both integers. This is a string, this comma in quotes, anything in double quotes like that is a string. And so basically Python doesn't know what to do when you try to add an integer to a string. If you try to add 2 integers, 2 numbers, it knows how to do that fine. If we had just print die1 plus die2, what it would do here is add together the values of the dice. So if we rolled a 1 and a 2, it would add those together to get 3, and it would print out 3. Now, if we were to have 2 strings, so if I had it print hello plus world, then it would print hello followed immediately by world. So the plus operator for strings means to concatenate them, to stick them together. The plus operator for integers means to do math. And so when you have integers and strings together, Python gets really confused. Not all scripting languages do. Sometimes they'll just make a best guess as to what you want to do, but Python isn't one of those. So because our operator means different things based on what type we have, and just a bit of lingo here, that's sometimes called overloading the operator. It does different things depending on what type you have, and that'll come to be useful as we get more into the object-oriented part of Python. Because of that, because the operator means different things depending on what type of values you have, we need to make everything the same type of value. So in the case of our dice here, we want each of these to be treated as strings because we want to actually print the value and concatenate with a comma and concatenate with the other value. And so to do that, we do something called casting. We're going to change the type, and we're going to do that here with str. str means treat the thing in parentheses like a string. It isn't actually changing the value of die1. That stays an integer, but it says inside here, take that integer and then turn it into a string. So this is take the string value of die1, concatenate that with a comma, concatenate that with the string value of die2, and if we save that and refresh over here, now it works fine and we get our values separated by a comma. Now, before we continue, I want to point out one thing. I write code every day, not in Python. And so all the languages I use require semicolons at the end of the lines. You don't need those in Python. It's just like natural for me to type them. So I'm going to try really hard not to do it, but if you see them popping in at the end of lines, it's just a force of habit. I'm going to try really hard, but don't worry if you see them there. They're not required ever. So now we have the ability to roll 2 dice, but I may ask you to roll 100 dice, or I may ask you to write a program where I tell you how many dice I want you to roll. And so in cases like that, you can't create one variable per die because you don't even know how many there are going to be. So in that case, we want to use a list or an array. In most languages, this would be called an array. For some reason in Python, they call them lists, but people sort of use the terms interchangeably. An array is essentially a numbered list. You can have a list of whatever stuff you want, and then there is a number or an index that allows you to access that. So we could make an array called dice, and I'm going to start off with it just equal to empty square brackets. So that means we have an array or in a list, but there's nothing in it yet, and we want to add stuff to it. So to do that, we could say dice.append, and then we can put in our random number generator here, and we could do that a second time. I'm going to comment these lines out. Remember that comments are pound signs in Python, and so this append basically says I'm adding an item on to my list here, and then if I want to print them, instead of using my variable names like die1 here, I will say dice, and then in square brackets the index or the number of the item. Remember, we start counting at 0, so our first element will be 0 and our second element will be 1. Hopefully that will work for us. Okay, and that works great. So there you go. That's some real basics of working with lists. And of course, you can see that I've repeated the code exactly the same line twice here. So if I were to ask you to create an array or a list with 100 dice, you could just repeat this line 100 times, and you would probably do that with a loop. So we've been lucky enough here to be using this function that we get from Python, randint, that generates a random number between a lower bound and an upper bound. A lot of programming languages don't give you that, and I just want us to kind of work another exercise that's going to push a little bit of our skills to make us remember how to do some different things, especially some computational thinking. So let's comment these 2 lines out. And what we're going to do here is find another way to generate a random number. So one way that you'll find in lots of programming languages is just the rand function or random function. So we're going to do random.random. Which seems a little repetitive, but that's how it is. This is going to generate a random number between 0 and 1, and so it's going to be a decimal point number. Let's just call that R for now, and then I'll comment out our printing down there, and we'll just print R so we can see what that's going to look like. If we flip over and run this, all right, so you can see we're getting this number randomly big and small. Okay, so we want to use that instead of randint here to generate our random number between 1 and 6. Now the only reason that we're doing this here is an exercise to get you thinking about this. You should of course use randint anytime that it's useful, but I want again for you to think about this computational thinking. If we only get a number between 0 and 1, how do we convert that to a number between 0 and 6? Well, first we need to make it bigger. So we could multiply it by 6. And that's going to get us partway there. Again, it doesn't solve the whole problem, but I like to do a tiny bit at a time. So let's save that. And now, when we run this, great, we're getting numbers that go from presumably 0 to 5.99. We're never going to get a 1 from that random number generator. It's going to go up to 0.99999. So it will go up to 5.9999 if we multiply it by 6. Okay, so now we need to get rid of those things after the decimal point because we want integers here. So there's a few ways to do that. So there's a rounding function. So you can do round. And what that's going to do is round your number just like you learned in elementary school. So it's going to round to the nearest integer. That means if your number is 1.7, it's going to round it to 2. If it's 1.1, it's going to round it to 1. So let's just take a look at how that works. All right, so we got a 0, we got a 2. Okay, so this is working fine. But part of the problem if we do it this way is that we will eventually get a 6. And we've got a 0, which means there's 7 possible numbers that we're getting here. And that's because if we have a 5.99, round is going to round it up. So we can do a few different things. The solution that I like best is actually, instead of rounding, to use int. So that means we're going to take this random number and turn it into an integer. This is casting. And if we turn it into an integer, the way that pretty much all programming languages do that, including Python, is just to drop everything after the decimal point. So let's compare the two here. Let's leave r as just the random number. And then we're going to do r round with rounding and r int in the int method. And then I'm going to print them both. So I'm going to print a string version of first of r. And then I'll do a tab to make that look nice. Sorry, there should be a plus. And then I'll do a string version of r round. And another tab. Having a hard time typing pluses here. And then a string version of r int. Okay, so we have string version of r, that's going to be our decimal place number, a tab, a string version of the rounded number, a tab, and a string version of the integer number. So we're going to be able to see all three. And let's refresh this and run it. So here we see a great example. Our random number times 6 is 4.6. That gets rounded to 5, it gets rounded up, but the integer value makes it 4. Sometimes, like this case, they'll be the same. Sometimes they'll be different. So if we always are rounding down, that's good because it's consistent. That means we're always going to have a number between 0 and 5, which is almost what we want. We want a number between 1 and 6 instead of 0 and 5. So we're going to comment out this r round. I'll comment out our printing. R int is what we want. And finally, we'll say our die is going to be that r int plus 1. So we're going to add 1. So instead of being 0 to 5, it's going to be 1 to 6. You could also put this in one statement. You could do 1 plus int of random dot random times 6. These are equivalent. I've just broken them up in the first case into 3 steps. You can do it in 1 step. And then if we were to print die and die 2, we're not necessarily going to get the same number because we're generating a random number each time, but we should be getting numbers between 1 and 6 for each of those examples. And that looks good. You always want to test it a bunch of times, especially when you're doing random number generation, but this looks good. So this is not at all superior to just using rand int, but it helps you think about what's the process if we're only given one type of thing we can do, like generating a number between 0 and 1. How do we turn that into the thing that we want? It gives us a little more practice with casting or changing types like we did here, along with some basic arithmetic. Okay, so let's do one more example. Here we're going to work a little bit with user input. So let's comment all of this back out. And I'm going to put this up so you'll have access to all of this code in Canvas. We're going to stick with our dice array, and then I'm going to copy this line here that was rolling the dice for us and put it up here. So I've copied it 6 times, which basically just means we've rolled a die 6 times, and it's stored in this array dice. Before we do anything, let's just take a look at what it looks like if we print dice. If I just print that array and run it, I get a list. Here's all of the numbers that are in my array of dice rolls. They're going to change each time. Okay, so I have 6 of those. Now let's say we're going to roll a dice 6 times, and then we're going to ask the user to pick one of the dice that they want to see the value of. So for example, I may type die number 1, and that should show me the first one. Now, of course, the index of this is 0, right? Remember, in the programming, we're going to label this 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, but we don't like to make all humans think that way. So a human could ask for, what's the first number? And it'll show us the 1 here. What's the 6th number? It'll show us the 1 here. So we're going to take user input, and we're going to use that to pull a value out of our array and display it. Okay, So we can get rid of that print dice for now. Now we want to take some user input. So to do that, we're going to ask for the number, and then we're going to use the command input, and then the instructions that we want to show the user. So please select which die you want to see. And they will type in a number. Okay, so let's just try to run that again. And I just noticed I was putting in semicolons, so let's get rid of those. Your code looks right. Let's just try to run that. It's not going to print anything out now, but it will take the user input. Just to show that it worked, let's print out that number. Okay, so it says, please select which die you want to see. I'm going to say 2, and it prints out 2. So that's working. This is a little bit ugly since my number is showing up right next to C. So let's just make that a little more user-friendly. Put in a colon and a space. Okay, so we know that num is storing that input correctly. And then what we want to do instead of printing num is print dice and then put num in brackets. Now this probably isn't going to work. Let's see what happens. Okay, so we got the error. And even though these errors are always messy, it actually does tell you what's going on. It says list indices must be integers or slices, not strings. So it's saying the thing that goes in those square brackets, it needs to be an integer, a whole number, not a string. And so it thinks that we have given it a string. And that's because we have given it what the user typed in, and the stuff that user types in is always considered a string. So we need to turn it into an integer. So we can go back to our code, and we want to say this thing num, even though it's user input, so it's a string, you want to turn that into an integer. And we could do it here, or we could do it down here. I'm going to do it here because it's always going to be an integer. There's no reason to store it as anything but. So I put int around that. This is just like the int that we used down here, or the string that we used down here. So we take this user input, we turn that into an integer, and then we store that in num. Now this should work. So if I type 3, it's showing us. Now what happens if I type 6? Now I get an error. Why do I get that error? There are 6 things in our array, so why am I getting a mistake if I say 6? Because I'm using the user input as an index, and the indices are one smaller. So if I want to see the 6th one, that's index number 5, because I start counting from 0. So we need to do num minus 1. So if the user types in 1, it's going to show it's the 0th die. It's going to use 0 as the index, and that'll be correct. So now if we run this, select which die you want to see, I can say 6. It works fine. I can say 1. Let's try it again. We'll run it and say 1, and it gives us the right answer. Now I can still break this. So I could type in 123, and I get this list index out of range. That's because there's no element 123. To handle that, we need to use some conditions, but that's something we're going to review next week. So that's our main review for this week. We've looked at creating variables. We've reviewed basic data structures with arrays using append here, and then using the square brackets to access them. We've looked at input from the users and output using print. We've reviewed importing packages like we did here with random. And we looked a little bit at casting, like turning this into an int, turning these into a string, concatenation, and some basic operators to do math like we did here. So that should give you some fundamentals. This should be hopefully pretty straightforward given everything that you learned last semester. I have 4 exercises for you to work on just to get some practice really doing this and debugging your own code. So I hope this is a lightweight, easy week because you remember everything you've done so far. But you're getting your hands back into it, and hopefully the exercises will build on this and give you a little bit of a challenge to remember how everything works.